Sometimes the loneliest men are those who've lived the fullest lives. Amos Reddington, 68, has buried everyone he loved. When he wins a derelict church at auction, he thinks he's found a quiet place to fade away. But his mule, Maisie, refuses to enter the overgrown cemetery behind it. Something's wrong with that ground. Curious, Amos starts clearing brush and old graves, until his shovel breaks through a coffin holding no bones. Inside are bags of jewelry and stolen heirlooms from a century past. The preacher had been robbing widows while preaching salvation. What Amos finds will force him to choose between easy money and hard redemption. Can a man with nothing left still find purpose in stolen treasure? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind carried dust across Main Street as Amos Reddington stood among the small crowd gathered outside the county courthouse. His face was a map of hard years, deep creases around the eyes from squinting into too many sunrises, weathered skin that had seen every season the high desert could throw at a man. His hands, resting on the brim of his hat, were thick and scarred, the knuckles swollen with arthritis that made mornings a particular kind of misery. 68 years old, and every single one of them showed he hadn't planned to come to this auction. Hadn't planned much of anything for the last 8 years, truth be told, since Sarah died. The auctioneer, Lyle Parson, was a thin man with a voice bigger than his frame, calling out lot numbers with practiced efficiency. Most of the items were unremarkable: foreclosed properties, abandoned homesteads, parcels of scrubland nobody wanted. The crowd was sparse. A few real estate speculators, some locals looking for bargains, and Amos, who'd wandered in mostly because he had nowhere else to be, in his shirt pocket, pressed against his heart, was the one thing he never went anywhere without: his father's pocket watch. Silver, tarnished now, the case engraved with initials worn smooth by decades of handling. It hadn't worked in 20 years, frozen at 347, but Amos carried it anyway. His father had given it to him the day Amos took over the family ranch, made him promise to pass it down to his own son someday. Amos had no son, had a daughter once, Sarah, beautiful girl, sharp as a tack, could ride better than most men. She died on a rain-slick highway 8 years ago, her car spinning into oncoming traffic. She was 40, left behind a husband and a boy, Thomas, who'd been 10 at the time. They'd moved away shortly after the funeral. Marcus, Sarah's husband, couldn't stand to stay in a place that reminded him of her. Amos understood. Hell, he'd sold his ranch for the same reason 2 years after Sarah died. Couldn't bear to see the places where she'd learned to rope, where she'd helped with carving season, where she'd sat on the porch reading books until the sun went down. Margaret, his wife, had been gone even longer. 12 years now. Cancer had taken her slowly, painfully, and by the end, she'd been a shadow of the woman who'd married him 43 years earlier. They'd been just kids then, both 19, full of dreams about building something together. They had built it, a good ranch, a good life, a good daughter. And then time and tragedy had dismantled it all, piece by piece. Now Amos drifted. He'd worked a dozen different jobs in the years since selling the ranch. Ranch hand here, stable manager there, odd jobs fixing fences or breaking horses for people who didn't remember when he'd been one of the most respected cattlemen in 3 counties. He never stayed long anywhere. Couldn't. The loneliness followed him like a shadow, but at least when he kept moving, he could pretend he was going somewhere. Lot 17, Lyle Parson announced, consulting his paperwork. Abandoned church and surrounding property. Corner of Cemetery Road and Old Post Road, Redemption Springs. Structure built 1887, last occupied 1905. 2 acres, includes overgrown cemetery. Property sold as is, no warranties. Opening bid, $3,000. Amos's attention, which had been wandering, snapped back. A church. He'd driven past it a few times over the years. A skeletal structure visible from the highway, windows broken, roof sagging, walls weathered grey. He'd never given it much thought. Just another relic of a town that was slowly dying, same as him. Do I hear 3,000? Lyle scanned the crowd. Silence. Nobody wanted an old church that was more ruin than building, especially one with a cemetery attached. Too much liability, too much history, too much trouble. 2,500. Lyle tried again, more silence. A woman near the front shifted her weight, considering, but said nothing. Amos didn't know why he raised his hand. Maybe it was the word cemetery that caught him. All those folks buried and forgotten, nobody to tend their graves or remember their names. Maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe he just recognized something in that abandoned church, something kindred in its emptiness. 2,500, thank you, sir, Lyle said, pointing to Amos. Do I hear 3,000? The woman at the front shook her head and stepped back. Nobody else moved, going once at 2,500. Going twice. Lyle paused, scanning the crowd one more time. Sold! To bid a 41 for $2,500. Just like that, Amos owned a church. He wasn't a religious man, hadn't set foot in a church, except for weddings and funerals in 40 years. But there was something fitting about it, he thought. A place dedicated to salvation and redemption, now just a hollow shell. Same as him. The paperwork took an hour. Lyle explained that the church had been seized for back taxes 20 years ago, had been sitting in county possession ever since. Nobody knew much about its history, except that it had closed down in the early 1900s after the preacher disappeared. The building was structurally unsound in places. The cemetery was overgrown and neglected, and there was no electricity or running water. Amos would need to arrange for utilities if he wanted them, though Lyle doubted the wiring was salvageable. You planning to fix it up? Lyle asked, curiosity getting the better of his professionalism. Maybe, Amos said. Or maybe just live in it. Lyle raised an eyebrow but didn't comment. Well, good luck to you. Let me know if you need recommendations for contractors. Amos paid with a cashier's check, nearly all the money he had left in the world. He'd been living cheap, saving what he could from the odd jobs, but $2,500 represented most of his liquid assets. He had a small pension from his years of ranch work, Social Security, and not much else. If this didn't work out, he'd be in serious trouble. But somehow that didn't worry him. What was the worst that could happen? He'd been living in motel rooms and borrowed spaces for years. At least now he'd have a roof over his head, even if it leaked. The church was 15 miles outside Redemption Springs proper, which wasn't much of a town anymore. Population maybe 800 on a good day. Most of them older folks who'd stayed because they had nowhere else to go or were too stubborn to leave. The downtown consisted of a general store, a diner, a post office, and a handful of other businesses that seemed to operate more out of habit than profit. The nearest real town was 40 miles away. Amos drove out to see his new property in his truck, a 1998 Ford that was more rust than paint, but still ran well enough. His mule, Maisie, was in a temporary stable in town. He'd pick her up tomorrow and bring her out. Maisie had been with him for 6 years, the most constant companion he'd had since Margaret died. Stubborn as hell, opinionated about everything but loyal. She'd carried his bedroll and supplies across half the state as he drifted from job to job. The church sat at the end of a rutted dirt road, surrounded by scrubgrass and sage. The structure was exactly as he'd remembered from glimpses on the highway: weathered wood, missing shingles, front steps half collapsed. But there was something about it in the late afternoon light that looked almost dignified. Like an old soldier still standing at attention despite the wounds, he parked and got out, his knees creaking almost as loud as the truck door. The air smelled of dust and wild onion. Somewhere a crow called, harsh and lonely. The front door was unlocked. The lock had rusted away years ago. Inside, the church was dim and musty. Afternoon sunlight slanted through the broken windows, illuminating dust motes that swirled in the air. The pews were still there, though many had been damaged by weather and time. Some were split, others overturned. At the front, a simple wooden altar stood beneath a faded cross painted directly on the wall. The paint had flaked away in places, making the cross look more like a scar than a symbol. To the right of the main sanctuary was a small room that must have been the preacher's quarters. It contained a rusted bed frame, a wooden desk with one leg shorter than the others, and a chair that might collapse if anyone sat in it. The floor was littered with debris, leaves, animal droppings, bits of plaster from the ceiling, but it was shelter. It had walls and most of a roof. Amos had slept in worse places. He spent the rest of the daylight hours exploring. The church had a small cellar accessed through a trapdoor behind the altar, probably used for storage, now home to spiders and mice. There was a hand pump outside that might still draw water if the well wasn't dry. And in back, separated from the church by about 50 yards of overgrown land, was the cemetery. The cemetery was surrounded by a low iron fence, most of it collapsed or missing. The gate hung at an angle on broken hinges. Inside, headstones jutted from the earth at odd angles, some fallen over, others so worn by weather that the inscriptions were illegible. The whole area was choked with sage, thistles, and dry grass that came up to Amos's knees. Maybe 40 graves, he estimated, though it was hard to tell. Some of the markers were simple wooden crosses that had long since rotted away, leaving only slight depressions in the ground. He walked among the graves slowly, reading what inscriptions he could. Most were from the late 1800s and early 1900s. Names he didn't recognize: Thornton, Burke, Macready, Hendricks. Men, women, children. Some had died young, fever, childbirth, accidents. Others had lived to old age, at least by frontier standards. 60s, 70s. He noted a cluster of small graves dated 1891. Probably a disease outbreak, measles or influenza. It made him sad. All these people buried and forgotten. No flowers, no visitors, no one to remember who they'd been or what they'd meant to anyone. Just names on weathered stones, slowly being reclaimed by the desert. He found a relatively flat spot near the front of the church and unrolled his bedroll. He'd sleep there tonight, under the stars. Tomorrow he'd figure out what needed to be done first, probably the roof, then clearing out the debris, maybe getting the pump working. It would take months of work to make the place even marginally comfortable. But he had nothing but time. As the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Amos sat on his bedroll and pulled out his father's watch. He ran his thumb over the engraving, thinking about all the promises he'd broken, all the people he'd let down. His father, who'd wanted the ranch to stay in the family. Margaret, who'd asked him to take care of himself after she was gone. Sarah, who'd needed a father and got a ghost instead. Thomas, his grandson, who'd reached out a few times in the first years after Sarah died, but Amos had been too lost in grief to respond properly. Eventually, Thomas stopped calling. Amos didn't blame him. Maybe, he thought, this church could be his own kind of redemption, not the religious kind. He'd made peace with the idea that whatever God existed probably didn't have much interest in Amos Reddington. But maybe he could restore something here. Give these forgotten dead some dignity. Fix up the building. Make something good out of something abandoned. It wasn't much of a purpose, but it was more than he'd had in a long time. He lay back on his bedroll and watched the stars emerge. The desert night was cold, but he'd brought plenty of blankets. Somewhere in the distance a coyote howled. Amos closed his eyes, and for the first time in years felt something that might have been peace. The next morning, Amos drove back into Redemption Springs to fetch Maisie and pick up supplies. The general store was run by a woman named Vera Macready, maybe 60, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that missed nothing. She greeted him with curiosity when he explained he'd bought the old church. "That place has been empty as long as I can remember," she said, totaling up his purchases: nails, a hammer, some rope, basic groceries. "My grandmother's buried in that cemetery. Haven't been out there in years, though. Too overgrown to even find the graves anymore." "I'll be clearing it," Amos said. Seemed like the right thing to do. Vera's expression softened. "That's kind of you." Grandmother was Elizabeth Macready, maiden name Thornton. Died in 1894, I think. If you find her stone, I'd appreciate knowing what it says. Family stories get fuzzy over time. Amos promised he would, paid for his supplies, and headed to the stable where Maisie waited. The mule greeted him with her usual display of indifference, though she didn't resist when he loaded her into the trailer. Maisie was 15 hands high, grey as storm clouds, with a white blaze down her face and the temperament of a tired judge. She tolerated Amos because he fed her and treated her well, but she made her own decisions about everything else. Back at the church, Amos unloaded Maisie and let her explore while he started making repairs. He patched the worst holes in the roof, cleared debris from the main room, and got the hand pump working after an hour of cursing and WD-40. The water came up rust brown at first, then cleared to something drinkable. Small victories. For 3 days he worked from sunrise to sunset, making the place marginally livable. He set up a camp stove, arranged his few possessions, swept out years of accumulated dirt. The physical work felt good, gave him purpose. His back ached and his hands blistered, but it was honest pain, the kind that came from building instead of destroying. On the 4th day he decided to start on the cemetery. It was a bigger job than the church itself. 40-some graves, all overgrown, stones tilted or fallen. He'd need to clear the brush first, then see about writing the headstones, maybe doing some basic landscaping. Make it look like someone cared. He gathered his tools, a shovel, a scythe for cutting the tall grass, heavy gloves, and called to Maisie to follow him out to the cemetery. The mule had been grazing contentedly near the church, but when Amos started walking toward the cemetery, she stopped. "Come on, girl," he said, gesturing. "Let's get to work." Maisie didn't move. Her ears went back, flat against her skull. Amos walked a few more steps. Maisie stayed rooted in place, 30 feet from the cemetery gate. He'd seen her stubborn before, but this was different. This was fear. "What's gotten into you?" he asked, walking back to her. He ran a hand down her neck, felt the tension in her muscles. "It's just a cemetery. Old bones underground. Nothing to worry about," but Maisie wouldn't be coaxed. Every time Amos tried to lead her toward the cemetery, she backed away, tossing her head and making a low, uneasy sound in her throat. After 10 minutes of trying, Amos gave up. He'd worked with enough animals in his life to know when they were being merely stubborn and when they were genuinely frightened. Maisie was frightened. That bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Mules had good instincts. If something felt wrong to Maisie, it was worth paying attention to. He left her by the church and entered the cemetery alone, feeling foolish for being unnerved by a mule's behavior. But as he stepped through the crooked gate, he felt it too. Not quite fear, but unease. A sense that something here was off. The work helped distract him. He started at the near end, cutting down the tall grass and sage, clearing debris. The physical effort was harder than at the church. The growth was thick and stubborn, and his arthritic hands protested every swing of the scythe. By mid-afternoon, he'd cleared maybe a quarter of the cemetery and could finally see some of the headstones clearly. Elizabeth Thornton, 1869–1894, beloved wife and mother. Taken too soon. That would be Vera's grandmother. Amos made a note to tell her. The stone was simple but well carved, still legible despite the years. Sarah Burke, 1868–1889, in loving memory, Thomas Hendricks. 1845–1898, he rests with the Lord. On and on, the stones told their small stories. Amos found the cluster of child graves from 1891, 5 children, ages ranging from 6 months to 12 years. An entire generation of a family wiped out. Their parents' graves were nearby, both dying within a year of the children. Grief, probably. Sometimes the heart just gave up. The sun was setting when Amos's shovel struck something that gave way with an unexpected sound, a splintering crack. He'd been working near one of the graves, clearing roots and settling soil around the base of a tilted headstone. The ground here felt soft, unstable. He knelt and brushed away loose dirt, revealing rotted wood a few feet down. His heart started beating faster. Wood shouldn't be this close to the surface. Graves were supposed to be 6 feet deep. This was maybe 3 feet, if that carefully, methodically. He dug around the edges. The wood was a coffin lid, deteriorated and fragile. It shouldn't be here, not at this depth, not positioned like this, slightly off-center from the headstone marking the grave. Amos sat back, breathing hard. Every instinct told him to stop, to fill the hole back in and forget he'd seen anything. But curiosity, And something deeper, some sense that this mattered, drove him forward. He cleared more soil, exposing the coffin's edges. It was small, narrow, an adult, but not a large one. He found the head end and carefully pried up the deteriorated lid. It came away in pieces, revealing not the expected remains, but something else entirely. Leather bags, 4 of them, stacked neatly where a body should have been. Amos's hands shook as he opened the first bag. Inside, wrapped in cloth, was jewelry. Rings, brooches, necklaces, all tarnished, all unmistakably valuable. He opened the second bag, found more of the same. Coins in the third, a mix in the fourth. He sat in the dirt, staring at the contents, his mind racing. This wasn't a grave. It was a hiding place. Someone had buried these items here, in the cemetery, disguised as a proper burial. He picked up a brooch, examined it in the fading light. Gold with a small diamond. The back was engraved, "To Anne, with eternal love." He found a locket, opened it. Inside was a faded photograph of a young girl, maybe 10 years old. On the back, "Our Sarah, beloved daughter." These weren't just valuables. These were personal items, the kind people buried with their loved ones. Family heirlooms, wedding rings, keepsakes meant to accompany the dead into whatever came next. Someone had robbed these graves, had stolen from the dead and hidden the loot in a false grave. The realization made Amos feel sick. He looked at the headstone near where he dug. "Beloved wife taken too soon." But there was no coffin 6 feet down with a body, just this shallow cache of stolen goods. As the last light faded, Amos carefully repacked the bags and covered the hole with a tarp, weighted down with rocks. He'd come back tomorrow in daylight, think this through properly. But one thought kept circling his mind. Maisie had known. Somehow, the mule had sensed that something was wrong with this ground. That night, Amos couldn't sleep. He lay in his bedroll in the church, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the jewelry, about the names inscribed on it, about families who'd buried their loved ones with precious mementos only to have them stolen, about how someone had violated not just property, but grief itself. And he thought about the brass nameplate he'd found at the bottom of the coffin, which he'd tucked into his pocket. Rev. Josiah Blackwell, the preacher, the man who'd stood in this very church, preaching about morality and salvation, had been robbing the dead in his own cemetery. Amos had found more than buried treasure. He'd found a crime that had gone unpunished for over a century. And now the question was, what was he going to do about it? Morning came with no answers, only more questions. Amos made coffee on his camp stove and sat on the church steps, watching Maisie graze in the pale dawn light. The mule seemed content now, far from the cemetery. She'd been right to be afraid. That ground held secrets. He went back to the hidden coffin and laid out the jewelry in the morning sun. Each piece told a story. A wedding ring engraved with "Forever Yours, 1887", a pocket watch with the initials TH, a brooch shaped like a rose, the kind a grandmother might have worn, a child's silver locket with the photograph inside. The locket affected him most. He opened it again, studied the girl's face. She looked like Sarah had at that age, serious eyes, a slight smile. Someone's daughter gone too soon, buried with her mother's locket so she wouldn't be alone. And then someone had stolen even that small comfort. His hands clenched. This wasn't just theft. It was cruelty. Amos counted the items, 37 pieces total. Wedding rings, mourning jewelry, personal effects. Each one had been carefully chosen by grieving families to accompany their dead. And Reverend Josiah Blackwell had taken them all. The brass nameplate proved it. Blackwell had hidden his plunder in his own cemetery, in a shallow, false grave that could pass for subsidence or poor construction if anyone noticed. Smart in a twisted way. Who would suspect a man of God? But Amos had more questions than answers. When had Blackwell stolen these? How many graves had he robbed? And what had happened to him? The church had closed in 1905, Lyle Parson had said. Had Blackwell run when someone discovered his crimes? Or had something else driven him away? He needed more information. The church itself might hold clues. Amos spent the morning searching the building more carefully than he had during his initial cleaning. He checked every cabinet, every drawer in the preacher's desk, every loose board. Most of what he found was mundane: old hymnals, moth-eaten vestments, a Bible so water-damaged the pages had fused together. But then he found the loose floorboard in the preacher's quarters. It was near the back corner, almost invisible unless you knew to look. Amos pried it up with his knife and found a cavity beneath, lined with oilcloth. Inside were 3 journals and a hand-drawn map. The journals were Blackwell's personal records written in neat, cramped handwriting. The first dated from 1885, when Blackwell had arrived in Redemption Springs to take over the church. The early entries showed an earnest young minister full of zeal and hope. He wrote about his sermons, his parishioners, his dreams of building a strong community of faith. Then the tone began to change. Entries from 1889 mentioned money troubles, gambling debts from his previous post that had followed him here, creditors pressing him, fear of exposure and disgrace. In 1890, the first theft. Blackwell wrote about it with the shaky rationalization of a desperate man. The widow Morris was buried today with her mother's pearls. She has no living children, no one to remember her. What use are pearls to the dead? While I, who served the living, face ruin, the entries became more frequent, more clinical. He developed a system. He would wait until after a burial, after the family had left, then return at night to excavate. He'd take only what wouldn't be immediately missed, jewelry buried with the body, not items left on top of the grave. He'd refill the grave carefully, making it look undisturbed. And he'd hide his plunder in the false coffin, adding to it after each theft. For 15 years, he'd gotten away with it. The journal entries showed how it had eaten at him, though. Early on, he wrote long passages justifying himself, explaining how the church needed the money, how he served a higher purpose. Later entries were shorter, darker. By 1900, they were just lists, names, dates, items taken. He'd stopped trying to justify it. He'd just accepted what he'd become. The final entries from late 1902 showed panic. Someone knew. Someone had discovered what he'd done. The handwriting became erratic, desperate. October 10th, 1902. A letter arrived today. No signature. The writer knows everything. He demands payment or he will expose me. $1,000 or my sins will be made public. I have no such sum. Even selling everything I've stolen wouldn't raise that amount, not without revealing myself. I'm trapped. October 12th, another letter. 3 days to pay or face destruction. My God, what have I done? I wanted to make it right, to confess and return what I took. But now even confession is denied me. If I come forward, I face jail. If I do nothing, I will be exposed as a criminal. There is no good choice left. October 15th, I have decided. I cannot face what I've become. I will leave tonight. Perhaps somewhere else I can start again, become the man I once hoped to be. I have reburied everything in the cemetery, marked the locations on a map hidden with this journal. May someone more righteous than I ever was find these things and return them to their proper owners. May they succeed where I failed. The journal ended there. No indication of where Blackwell had gone or what had happened to him. Just a broken man fleeing his crimes. Amos turned to the map. It showed the cemetery layout with 5 sections marked in different symbols. Circles, crosses, stars, triangles, squares. He'd found the circle section. 4 more hiding places remained. He sat in the dim room, holding the journals, feeling the weight of another man's sins. Blackwell had been a thief and a coward. But he'd also been human, capable of remorse, destroyed by weakness and bad choices. Not so different from anyone else, just unlucky in how far he'd fallen. The sound of a vehicle approaching broke Amos's concentration. He quickly hid the journals and map back under the floorboard and stepped outside. A pickup truck pulled up, newer than his, much cleaner. The woman who got out was Vera McCready from the general store, carrying a wicker basket. Thought you might appreciate some home cooking, she said, smiling. It's not much, just some cornbread and beans. But a man working as hard as you probably isn't eating proper meals. Amos accepted the basket with genuine gratitude. That's kind of you. More than kind. They sat on the church steps together, and Vera looked out at the cemetery. "Did you find my grandmother's stone?" "I did," Amos said. "Elizabeth Thornton. The stone says she was a beloved wife and mother. Died in 1894. Vera's eyes grew misty. "Family stories say she was only 25. Pneumonia took her. Left my grandfather with 3 small children. He never remarried. Said nobody could replace her." She paused, then added, "Grandmother was buried with her mother's wedding ring. It had been passed down through 4 generations. My grandfather wanted her to have it, even though times were hard and they could have sold it for desperately needed money. He said some things were more important than survival." Amos felt the words like a punch to the gut. The ring was in that hidden coffin. Vera's great-great-great-grandmother's ring, stolen from Elizabeth Thornton's grave by a desperate preacher. He wanted to tell her. Wanted to run inside, grab that ring, and put it in her hands right now. But doing so would raise questions he wasn't ready to answer. What was he doing digging up graves? How had he found it? And more importantly, what about all the other families, all the other stolen items? If he was going to do this right, he needed a plan. "That's a beautiful story," he said instead. "Your grandmother must have been special." "She was," Vera said softly. Then she smiled, breaking the melancholy mood. "I'll let you get back to work. But if you need anything, supplies, help, or just company, you come find me, all right? It's good to have you here, Amos. That church has been lonely too long." After she left, Amos stood in the cemetery for a long time, looking at the graves. 23 families, Blackwell's journal had said. 23 violations of trust and grief. And somewhere among those families were descendants who still remembered, still felt the loss. What would he do? The easy answer was to sell the jewelry and keep quiet. It would solve all his financial problems. Nobody would ever know, but Maisie would know. And more importantly, he would know. He'd spent 8 years running from responsibility, from connection, from anything that required him to be more than a ghost drifting through other people's lives. Maybe it was time to stop running. Maybe it was time to do something that mattered, even if it was hard. Maybe especially because it was hard. That night, Amos read through Blackwell's sermon notes by lamplight. The preacher had been gifted with words. There was no denying it. His sermon spoke beautifully about honesty, righteousness, the importance of living with integrity. Page after page of eloquent exhortations to resist temptation, to choose virtue over expedience, to build lives on foundations of truth. The bitter irony twisted like a knife in Amos's stomach. Blackwell had preached all the right words while doing all the wrong things. Had he believed any of it when he stood at that pulpit? Or had it all been performance, empty phrases mouthed by a man who'd already sold his soul? Amos found himself comparing Blackwell's journey to his own. Different sins maybe, but the same underlying weakness, the same capacity for self-deception. He remembered a moment 30 years back, during a drought year when money was tight and cattle were dying. A buyer had come looking for breeding stock, willing to pay top dollar. Amos had sold him 6 heifers, knowing 2 of them were sick, obviously not yet, but he'd seen the signs. He'd needed the money desperately. Margaret had been pregnant with Sarah, medical bills piling up, and the bank was threatening foreclosure. He'd made the sale and hated himself for it. The buyer had discovered the sick cattle a week later and threatened legal action. Amos had made it right. Borrowed money he couldn't afford, bought the man replacement heifers, added extra to compensate for the trouble. But the shame had stayed with him. Margaret had known something was wrong, had pressed him until he confessed. She'd been disappointed, but she'd forgiven him. She always did. Sarah had never known about it. Amos had made sure of that. He'd wanted his daughter to think better of him than he deserved, and now here he was, holding stolen jewelry, facing a similar choice. Keep it and live comfortably, or do the hard right thing and stay poor. The difference was, this time he wasn't desperate. He had enough to survive. Social security, his small pension, the church's shelter. He wouldn't be comfortable, but he wouldn't starve. The only thing driving him toward keeping the jewelry was simple greed, dressed up as practicality. He thought about Vera's grandmother's ring, thought about that little girl's locket, thought about all the families who'd buried their loved ones with precious mementos, trusting that at least in death their treasures would be safe. By morning, he'd made his decision. He would excavate the remaining caches, catalogue everything, and find a way to return it all to the families or their descendants. It wouldn't be easy. Some families might be impossible to trace. Legal complications could arise. But it was the right thing to do. And maybe, just maybe, doing one right thing might start to balance out a lifetime of wrong ones. The second excavation took 2 full days. The cross symbol on Blackwell's map marked a section near the back of the cemetery, close to the iron fence. Amos worked slowly, methodically, his back protesting every shovel of dirt. His hands blistered despite the heavy gloves. He wasn't as young as he used to be, and this work made sure he knew it. Maisie watched from her safe distance, occasionally wandering closer, but never crossing the invisible line she'd drawn between acceptable ground and the cemetery itself. Smart mule. The second cache was larger than the first. More jewelry, including some particularly fine pieces, a sapphire brooch, diamond earrings, several gold watches, silver candlesticks, the kind meant for a formal dining table. A small leather-bound diary. Amos sat in the dirt, holding the diary with careful hands. The pages were yellowed and fragile, but the ink had held. The name inside the front cover read, Elizabeth Thornton, property of Vera's grandmother. The diary covered the last year of Elizabeth's life, 1893 to early 1894. The entries were short, daily observations mixed with deeper reflections. She wrote about her husband, her children, her hopes for their futures. She mentioned the sapphire brooch specifically in an entry from December 1893. Mother's brooch remains my greatest treasure, passed from her mother before her. I shall wear it when I am laid to rest, a reminder that love spans generations, and even death cannot sever those bonds. The final entry was written a week before she died. The pneumonia worsens. Doctor says there is little hope. I am not afraid. I will see Mother soon, and she will recognize her brooch. John promises to bury me with it. I'm grateful beyond words. Amos closed the diary, his eyes burning. Elizabeth Thornton had been 25 years old, dying slowly, finding comfort in the idea that she'd be buried with her mother's brooch as a symbol of continuity and love. And then Josiah Blackwell had stolen it from her grave. The violation felt personal now, as if Amos had known Elizabeth, as if she'd been a friend. The diary had made her real in a way the headstone never could. He carefully wrapped the diary in oilcloth and added it to his growing collection of evidence. The brooch, too. Vera had a right to both items, along with her grandmother's ring from the first cache, but he couldn't just show up at Vera's store and hand them over. Too many questions. Where did he find them? Why was he digging in the cemetery? What else had he found? He needed to think this through, plan it properly. That evening brought another visitor, a sheriff's patrol car pulling up to the church just as the sun was setting. Amos's heart kicked into a higher gear. Had someone reported him? Seen him digging in the cemetery and gotten suspicious? The man who stepped out of the car was younger than Amos by maybe 20 years, trim and professional in his uniform. He had the easy confidence of someone comfortable with authority, but not corrupted by it. Evening, the sheriff said, extending a hand. Clayton Burke. Thought I'd stop by and introduce myself. Make sure everything's all right with your new property. Amos shook his hand, trying to keep his expression neutral. Amos Reddington. Everything's fine, thank you. Good, Burke said, looking around. This place has been empty a long time. Glad to see someone taking care of it. You planning to restore it? Doing what I can, Amos said. Not much of a budget, but I'm making progress. They made small talk for a few minutes. The weather, the condition of the building, Amos's plans for basic repairs. Burke seemed genuinely friendly, not suspicious. But then he mentioned, almost casually, my great-aunt's buried in that cemetery. Sarah Burke. Died young, back in 1889. I've been meaning to come out here and find her grave, pay respects, but never seemed to find the time. The name struck Amos like a slap. He'd seen it on one of the headstones he'd uncovered. Sarah Burke, 1868-1889, in loving memory. I'm clearing the cemetery, Amos said, keeping his voice steady. Lot of overgrowth. But if I come across that stone, I'll let you know. Appreciate it, Burke said. He looked out at the cemetery, his expression distant. Family stories say she was buried with a cameo brooch that had been her mother's. She was only 21 when she died. Viva took her. My great-grandfather never got over it. Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Another family, another stolen treasure, another wound that never healed. Burke turned back to Amos. Well, I'll let you get back to your evening. Just wanted to check in, make sure you had everything you needed. You run into any trouble or have questions, you let me know. After the sheriff left, Amos sat on the church steps and watched the stars emerge. Two families now, Vera's and Burke's, had directly mentioned items buried with their relatives. Items that were currently sitting in a box inside the church, stolen by a dead preacher more than a century ago. The weight of what he'd discovered pressed down on him. This wasn't just about returning stolen property anymore. It was about giving families closure, about healing wounds that had festered for generations, about restoring not just objects but trust, memory, dignity. He thought about his own family, about Margaret buried in a cemetery 3 counties over, her grave probably overgrown by now, since he hadn't visited in years. About Sarah, whose grave he'd visited exactly once because he couldn't bear to see her name carved in stone. About Thomas, his grandson, whom he'd abandoned in the fog of grief. Maybe returning stolen items to strangers was easier than facing his own failures. Maybe he was using this as a way to avoid looking at his own life. Or maybe, and this felt closer to the truth, maybe doing something good for others was the only way he knew how to start forgiving himself. Either way, he was committed now. He'd found the first 2 caches and would find the other 3. He'd catalogue every item, research every family, and find a way to return what had been taken. And if it cost him everything, if it brought him legal trouble or social censure, so be it. He'd spent 8 years being nobody, doing nothing, existing without purpose. At least now he had a reason to wake up in the morning, even if that reason was cleaning up another man's sins. The next morning, Amos returned to searching the church with renewed purpose. He'd found journals and a map, but there might be more, letters, records, anything that could help him understand the full scope of Blackwell's crimes and identify the families affected. He examined Blackwell's personal Bible more carefully this time. It was a heavy leather-bound volume, King James Version, the kind meant to last generations. The pages were thin as whispers, many of them marked with underlined passages. Blackwell had been particular about Psalms and the letters of Paul, especially passages about grace, forgiveness, redemption. The binding felt unusually thick. Amos ran his fingers along the edge, found a slight gap where the leather pulled away from the board beneath. He worked at it carefully with his knife, not wanting to damage the book unnecessarily, and discovered the back cover had been hollowed out, a hidden compartment about an inch deep. Inside was a sealed envelope, yellowed with age. The seal had been broken and resealed with wax multiple times, as if Blackwell had opened and closed it repeatedly, unable to decide what to do with it. Amos opened it carefully and found a letter dated October 16th, 1902. The handwriting was Blackwell's, but shakier than in the journals, written by a man under extreme stress. To whom it may concern, it began. I write this confession, knowing I lack the courage to deliver it publicly. I'm a thief and a hypocrite. For 15 years, I have stolen from the dead who were placed in my care. I have robbed 23 graves of their treasures, taking what grieving families left as symbols of love and remembrance. The letter went on to detail each theft, the names of the deceased, the items taken, the dates. It matched what was in the journals, but was more formal, meant as an official confession. Near the end, Blackwell wrote, I wanted to make restitution. God knows I wanted to become the man I pretended to be every Sunday. But I am a coward trapped by my own sins. Someone has discovered my crimes and threatens to expose me unless I pay $1,000. I have no such sum. Even selling everything I stole would not raise that amount without revealing myself. I see now there is no escape except flight. I have reburied everything in the cemetery, marking the locations on a map hidden with my journals. May someone more righteous than I find these things and return them. May they succeed where I failed. May God have mercy on my soul, for I have none for myself." The letter ended there, unsigned. A confession written but never sent, hidden away like everything else Blackwell had tried to bury. Amos read it 3 times, feeling the desperation bleeding through every line. Blackwell had wanted to do right, but had been paralyzed by fear. And then someone had forced his hand, the mysterious blackmailer who had driven him to flee. But who? And how had they known about the thefts? Amos went to the town library that afternoon. It was a small building, 1 room, run by a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s who introduced herself as Martha Hensley. "I'm researching the history of the old church," Amos explained. "Thought you might have records, old newspapers, that kind of thing?" Martha's face lit up. "Oh, I love a good historical project. We've got boxes of material from that era. The church was quite important to the community back then. Let me pull what we have." She returned with 3 archive boxes full of documents, church bulletins, town newspapers from 1880 to 1910, census records, burial logs. Amos settled at a table and began reading. The newspapers were fascinating. He found mentions of Reverend Blackwell's sermons, descriptions of church events, birth and death announcements. The obituaries were particularly useful. They often mentioned what items were buried with the deceased. He began making a list, cross-referencing with what he'd found in the cemetery. Martha brought him coffee and sat down across from him. "Finding what you need?" "More than I expected," Amos said honestly. "This town has quite a history." "That it does," Martha said. "My family has been here since the 1870s. My great-grandmother is buried in that church cemetery, Margaret Hensley. Died in 1896. Family stories say she was quite the character." Another connection. Amos made a mental note. If Margaret Hensley had been buried with any personal items, they might be in one of the uncovered caches. "What made you buy that old place?" Martha asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. Amos considered how much to reveal. Seemed like it needed someone to care about it. "All those graves, all those people forgotten. Figured I could at least clean it up, make it respectable again." Martha studied him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "You're looking for something specific, aren't you?" "It's more than just historical curiosity." She was too perceptive. Amos deflected. "Just trying to understand what happened. Why the church closed, where Reverend Blackwell went. There's not much in the official records." "No, there wouldn't be," Martha said. "From what I've heard from family stories, there were rumors. Nothing concrete, just whispers that something wasn't right. My great-uncle was deputy sheriff back then. This would be 1902 or so. He apparently had suspicions about Blackwell, but couldn't prove anything. Then the preacher vanished, and the case went cold. The church limped along for a few more years with circuit preachers, but eventually it closed for good." "What kind of suspicions?" Amos asked carefully. Martha shrugged. "That's where the stories get vague. Something about money, about things not adding up. But my great-uncle died in 1945, and whatever he knew died with him." Amos returned to the church that evening with photocopies of obituaries and cemetery records. He had the beginnings of a comprehensive list: names, dates, families, items buried. It would take weeks to research all 23 families, to trace lineages and find living descendants. But it was possible. Difficult, time-consuming, but possible. Over the next several days, he excavated the 3rd marked grave, the star symbol on Blackwell's map. More jewelry emerged, including a particularly fine gold pocket watch with intricate engraving. It was inscribed, "To my beloved husband Thomas, 1889. Amos checked his lists. Thomas Hendricks died 1898. The watch must have been his wife's gift, buried with him when he died. Or supposed to have been. The work was taking its toll. Amos's back ached constantly now, a dull throb that radiated down his legs. His hands were a mess of blisters and calluses. He was losing weight, not eating properly, too focused on the excavation and research. But he couldn't stop. Every cache he uncovered added to his sense of urgency. Vera visited again, bringing food and conversation. They sat on the church steps together as the sun set, eating her homemade stew and talking about nothing important. But Amos found himself looking forward to her visits, to the easy companionship she offered. He hadn't realized how lonely he'd been until he had someone to share meals with again. "You're working yourself too hard," Vera said, studying his face. "You look exhausted." "I'm fine," Amos said, though he knew it was a lie. "When's the last time you took a day off?" "Just rested?" He couldn't remember. "I'll rest when the work's done. And when will that be?" "Good question. When would it be done? When he'd excavated all 5 caches? When he'd traced all 23 families? When he'd returned every stolen item?" The task felt endless. "You know," Vera said quietly, "my grandmother used to say that sometimes the hardest part of carrying a burden is admitting you need help." She wasn't just talking about physical work, Amos realized. She sensed something larger was going on, even if she didn't know what. "Maybe," he said, "but some burdens a man has to carry alone." "That's nonsense, and you know it," Vera said, but gently. "Pride wrapped up as nobility. Whatever you're doing out here, Amos, and I suspect it's more than just clearing graves, you don't have to do it alone." After she left, Amos sat in the gathering darkness and thought about her words. She was right, of course. He was trying to handle this alone, and it was slowly crushing him. But involving others meant revealing what he'd found, and that meant answering difficult questions. What if they wanted to take everything, turn it over to authorities? What if the items ended up seized as evidence, locked away in some government warehouse? What if the families never got their belongings back? No, he'd keep going alone, at least a while longer, until he had a better plan, a clearer path forward. He went inside and pulled out Blackwell's journals again, reading by lamplight. The preacher's journey from idealism to corruption, from hope to despair, read like a cautionary tale. How did good men become bad men? Not in one dramatic moment, but in small compromises, one after another, until they looked up and didn't recognize themselves anymore. Amos understood that journey better than he wanted to. Admit, the 4th excavation revealed a tin-type photograph wrapped in oilcloth along with the jewelry. The photograph showed a man in his 40s, dressed in formal preacher's attire, standing stiffly before the camera. His face was stern, but his eyes held something else, a haunted quality, a weariness that went deeper than physical exhaustion. Reverend Josiah Blackwell. It had to be. Amos studied the photograph for a long time. The man staring back at him wasn't a monster. He was just a man, tired, desperate, trapped by his own choices. In different circumstances, with different pressures, he might have been remembered as a good preacher, a decent man. Instead, he'd become a thief and a coward. The photograph made Blackwell real in a way the journals hadn't quite managed. Seeing his face, the weight in his eyes, Amos found it harder to think of him as simply a villain. He was human, flawed, broken, not so different from anyone else who'd faced impossible choices and made the wrong ones. That realization troubled Amos more than he wanted to admit. Because if Blackwell was human, capable of both good and evil, then any of us could become what he'd become. There but for the grace of God, as the saying went, Amos thought about his own darkest moment. Standing at the edge of a cliff a year after Margaret died, seriously contemplating stepping off. The grief had been so complete, so crushing, that death had seemed like mercy. The only thing that had stopped him was Sarah calling to say she needed him to watch Thomas for the weekend. That phone call had saved his life, and then Sarah had died, and Thomas had moved away, and Amos had been right back at that edge. He hadn't stood at a literal cliff the second time, but he'd stood at the edge of oblivion all the same. The drinking, the aimless drifting, the slow dissolution of everything he'd built, that was just a slower form of the same ending. He'd pulled back from that edge eventually, but only barely. And now here he was, holding stolen jewelry and trying to figure out how to redeem another man's sins when he couldn't fully redeem his own. The parallel was uncomfortable. Blackwell had run from shame, Amos had run from grief. Both had abandoned their responsibilities. Both had hurt people who trusted them. Both had ended up alone. The difference, Amos told himself, was that he was trying to do better, trying to make something right, even if it was someone else's wrong. But was that enough? The question haunted him as he returned to the library for more research. Martha greeted him with a knowing smile. Back again. You're getting to be a regular fixture around here. Your archives are more interesting than I expected, Amos said. Find anything useful? Pieces of the puzzle, Amos said carefully. Still trying to put it all together. Martha brought him fresh files, census records, property deeds, tax assessments from the turn of the century. Amos began mapping out family trees, tracking descendants, building connections. He discovered that Sheriff Clayton Burke's great-aunt Sarah Burke had been survived by 2 siblings, one of whom was Burke's great-grandfather. The family line was clear and documented. Vera's grandmother, Elizabeth Thornton, had been survived by 3 children. Vera descended from the oldest, a son named John. The lineage was straightforward. Martha's great-grandmother, Margaret Hensley, had 5 children. Martha came from the youngest daughter's line. Slowly, painstakingly, Amos built a picture of who these people had been, who they'd left behind, who might still care about the items stolen from their graves, of the 23 families Blackwell had robbed. Amos could identify current descendants for 17. 5 families had apparently died out or moved away without leaving traceable lineages. One family's records were too incomplete to be certain. But 17 families, that was 17 opportunities to make things right. The work consumed him. He spent his days researching and his evenings excavating. The physical toll grew worse. His back spasmed regularly now, sharp pains that took his breath away. He developed a persistent cough from the dust and exertion. Sleep came hard and left early, but he kept going, driven by something he couldn't quite name. Purpose maybe, or guilt, or the simple fact that for the first time in 8 years, he felt like he was doing something that mattered. A week into his research, Martha cornered him with a cup of coffee and a concerned expression. "Amos, I like you. You're a good man, clearly dedicated to whatever this project is. But you look terrible. When's the last time you slept through the night?" "I'm fine. That's what everyone says right before they collapse," Martha said. "Listen, I don't know what you're really looking for in these archives. But whatever it is, it's eating you alive. That's not healthy." Amos started to deflect again, but something in Martha's expression stopped him. She wasn't prying out of nosiness. She was genuinely concerned. "And maybe it was time to trust someone. If I told you I'd found evidence of a crime," he said slowly. "An old crime from more than 100 years ago, would you help me understand what to do about it?" Martha's eyes sharpened. "What kind of crime?" "Theft, violation of graves. Someone in a position of trust stealing from the dead." "Reverend Blackwell," Martha said immediately. Amos blinked, startled. "How did you—" "Please. I've spent 3 decades as a librarian. I know how to read between the lines. You show up asking about the church, about families buried in that cemetery, about who's descended from whom. And you look haunted. Doesn't take a genius to put it together." She leaned forward. "What did you find?" The relief of finally telling someone was so intense it made Amos's hands shake. He explained everything. The excavation, the hidden caches, the journals, the confession letter. Martha listened without interrupting, her expression moving from shock to sadness to grim determination. 23 families, she said when he finished. "My God, that's monstrous." "It is," Amos agreed. "But here's my problem. I don't know what to do now. Report it to authorities? They'll seize everything, and who knows if the families will ever see their belongings. Just hand items to descendants directly? That might be illegal. And there's still the question of what happened to Blackwell. Did he just run, or did something worse happen?" Martha was quiet for a long moment. "Can you show me? The items, the journals, all of it?" Amos hesitated, then nodded. "Come out to the church tomorrow. I'll show you everything." That evening, as he prepared for Martha's visit, Amos excavated what he thought might be the final cache, the square symbol on Blackwell's map. But as his shovel broke through, he realized this grave was different. There was a body, not a coffin filled with jewelry. An actual human skeleton, still articulated, lying in the dirt. The burial had been hasty, shallow, only about 3 feet deep. The body hadn't been placed in a coffin, just wrapped in what had once been a blanket, now rotted away to almost nothing, and on the skeletal hand was a gold signet ring with an onyx stone. Amos carefully brushed away the dirt and examined the ring without removing it. Engraved on the stone were the initials J.B. Josiah Blackwell. The preacher hadn't run away after all. Someone had killed him and buried him in his own cemetery, in an unmarked grave outside the consecrated ground. Amos sat back, his heart pounding. This changed everything. This wasn't just about theft anymore. It was about murder. He carefully covered the grave again, marking the location. This was beyond his ability to handle alone. This needed authorities, forensic examination, proper procedure. But first, he needed Martha's help to figure out how to handle all of it. The theft, the murder, the restitution. He'd gone looking for simple answers and found only complexity. Found a dead man who might have been murdered for crimes he'd committed, or by someone who'd wanted to silence him, or by the blackmailer who'd driven him to desperation. That night, Amos barely slept. He kept thinking about Blackwell's final journal entry, about someone threatening to expose him. Had that person simply wanted money, or had they wanted Blackwell dead? And who would benefit from the preacher's death? Who would have known about the thefts, used that knowledge to threaten Blackwell, and then killed him when he couldn't pay? The answer, Amos realized, had to be someone who'd been in Redemption Springs in 1902, someone with access to information, someone who might have noticed inconsistencies, someone who'd seen an opportunity. Tomorrow he'd show Martha everything. Together, maybe they could figure out what had happened and how to make it right. At least, he wouldn't be carrying this burden alone anymore. Outside, Maisie snorted in her sleep. Amos looked out at the cemetery, at the disturbed ground where Josiah Blackwell had lain for over a century, and wondered if the preacher had found any peace in death that he'd been denied in life. Martha arrived mid-morning, driving her old sedan carefully up the rutted road. Amos had laid everything out in the church. The jewelry organized by cash, the journals, the map, the confession letter, photographs of the excavation sites. It looked like a museum exhibit dedicated to crime. Martha's hands went to her mouth when she saw it all. "Oh my God, Amos, this is real. I mean, I believed you, but seeing it, I know," he said quietly. She moved through the items slowly, reverently. When she reached the jewelry from the second cache, she stopped. Her hands shook as she picked up a small brooch shaped like a bird. Delicate silver wings spread in flight. "This was my great-grandmother's," she whispered. "I've seen it in family photographs. She's wearing it in her wedding portrait. When she died, my great-grandfather insisted she be buried with it. He said she'd loved birds, that she'd want to fly free." Tears ran down Martha's face. Amos stepped close, put a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I'm so sorry. For what happened to her, for what Blackwell did." Martha wiped her eyes, carefully set the brooch down. "Don't apologize. You didn't do this. You found it. You're trying to make it right." She took a shaky breath. "Show me the rest." Amos walked her through everything, explaining his research, the family connections he'd traced, his plans to return items to descendants. Martha listened, asked sharp questions, made notes. Her librarian's mind was already organizing, planning. Then he showed her the photographs of the unmarked grave, the skeletal remains, the signet ring. "Blackwell didn't run," Martha said. "Someone killed him. That's what I think. But I don't know who or why, beyond the obvious. He was being blackmailed, couldn't pay, and maybe the blackmailer decided dead men don't talk." Martha frowned, thinking. But if the blackmailer killed him, why not take the treasure? Why leave it buried? Maybe they didn't know the exact locations. Blackwell's map was well hidden. Or maybe, Martha said slowly, the blackmailer wasn't after the treasure. Maybe they were after something else? Like what? I don't know. But let me dig deeper into the records. There might be something we're missing. They spent the afternoon going through everything again, this time with Martha's expertise guiding them. She suggested they search for more documents in the church, financial records, correspondence, anything that might shed light on who knew about the thefts. In the preacher's desk, Buried under layers of detritus, Amos found a metal box he'd initially dismissed as empty. Martha insisted on checking it more carefully. She discovered a false bottom, thin metal sheet that looked like the base of the box, but actually concealed a hidden compartment. Inside were more documents, property deeds, contracts, receipts, and something that made Amos's blood run cold, a deed to the church property itself, dated 1891, showing that Josiah Blackwell had personally purchased the land. Not the diocese, not the church organization, Blackwell himself. "That can't be right," Martha said, scanning the document. "Churches don't work that way. The property should have been held by the diocese or some kind of church trust." Amos found more documents, a contract with the builders who'd constructed the church, receipt for materials, payments to laborers, all made out to Blackwell personally, all dated 1891 to 1892. "He built this church with his own money," Amos said, the realization dawning. "Or at least that's what the records show." Martha pulled out her phone, started doing calculations. The land cost $800 according to this deed. The building materials and labor, she added up the receipts, another $1,200. $2,000 total. They looked at each other, the same thought occurring to both simultaneously. "His journals," Amos said. "The first thefts were in 1890. By 1891, he'd stolen from," he checked his notes, "at least 8 families. The estimated value of what he took in those first 2 years would be around $2,000, Martha finished. Exactly what he needed to buy this land and build this church. The implications hit Amos like a physical blow. The church itself, this entire structure, had been built with stolen money. Every board, every nail, every stone had been purchased with items taken from grieving families. So the church isn't just the site of his crimes, Martha said. It's the product of them. The building itself is evidence, which means, Amos continued, his mind racing, my purchase might not even be legal. If Blackwell bought the land with stolen funds, if he never actually had legitimate ownership, then the property transfer might be void, Martha finished. The descendants of the people he stole from might have a claim. They sat in silence, both overwhelmed by this new dimension of the problem. The church that Amos had thought would be his salvation, his purpose, his redemption. It was all built on theft and betrayal. There's more, Martha said, still reading through the documents. Look at this correspondence. She handed Amos a letter dated October 1891 from the land seller to Blackwell. It confirmed the sale and included a strange notation. As agreed, I will not mention the source of your funds to the diocese or town authorities. Your secrets remain your own. The seller knew, Amos said. Knew or suspected that Blackwell's money wasn't legitimate, and kept quiet about it. For a price, probably. Martha shuffled through more papers. Here, another payment to the same man, dated 1893. $500. No explanation given. Hush money, Amos said. Blackwell was being blackmailed even before 1902. The final blackmail wasn't the first, it was just the one that broke him. Martha's expression was grim. We need to find out who this land seller was, and what happened to him. They returned to the library with renewed purpose. Martha pulled tax records, property transfers, business registrations for Redemption Springs from 1890 to 1905. The land seller's name was Charles Crenshaw, listed as a real estate speculator from a neighboring county, but the trail got stranger. In 1902, a Reverend Samuel Crenshaw arrived in Redemption Springs to take over the church after Blackwell's disappearance. He stayed exactly 2 years, until 1904, then left abruptly. The church closed shortly after. Same last name, Martha said. Could be a coincidence, or Charles Crenshaw's son or brother, Amos finished. Someone who knew about the land deal, knew about Blackwell's crimes, and saw an opportunity. They dug deeper. Reverend Samuel Crenshaw had come from a church in Colorado under somewhat murky circumstances. The local newspaper from his previous town, which Martha found through interlibrary archives, mentioned that Reverend Crenshaw had left his position to pursue other opportunities, but hinted at financial irregularities that were never fully explained. He had money problems, Martha said. Needed cash. His father or relative had sold land to Blackwell and probably knew about the stolen funds. So Samuel comes to Redemption Springs, maybe thinking he can blackmail Blackwell, get a piece of the action. But Blackwell can't pay, Amos continued. He's already reburied everything, written his confession, planning to flee. So what does Samuel do? Kills him, Martha said quietly. Buries him in the cemetery, takes over the church, searches for the treasure, but never finds it, Amos added, because the map was too well hidden. After 2 years of looking, Samuel gives up and leaves. The church closes. The secret stays buried for another century. It was speculation, but it fit the facts. They had no proof that Samuel Crenshaw was the murderer, just circumstantial evidence and logical inference. But it made sense in a grim way. Amos looked at the documents spread across the library table. So what do I do now? The church is built on stolen money. The preacher who built it was murdered. My legal ownership is questionable, and I'm sitting on stolen property that belongs to 17 different families, plus the remains of a murder victim. Martha leaned back, thinking, we need help. This is too big for us to handle alone. Sheriff Burke? Maybe. But first, she paused, looked at him seriously. We need to make a decision. Do we want this handled legally, by the book, with all the complications that brings? Or do we want to focus on what matters most, getting these items back to the families who lost them? Amos understood what she was asking. The legal route would mean authorities, investigations, possible criminal charges for disturbing graves, seizure of evidence. The items might end up in storage for years while courts sorted out ownership. The families might never see them. The other route would mean taking matters into their own hands, returning items directly, operating outside official channels. It might be legally questionable, but it would give families closure. I spent 8 years running from responsibility, Amos said. From hard choices, from doing what was right instead of what was easy. I'm done running. We do this right. We tell the families what happened. We give them back what was stolen. And if that means I lose the church, if it means legal trouble, so be it, Martha smiled. I was hoping you'd say that, because I have an idea. Martha's idea was simple, but required careful execution. They would organize a community gathering at the church. They'd present their findings, explain the history, and return items directly to descendants. They'd bypass bureaucracy and focus on healing. But we need to do this right, Martha said. Document everything, verify every family connection, prepare for questions. We'll need at least 2 weeks. 2 weeks. Amos felt the weight of those days ahead. But Martha was right. This couldn't be rushed. They needed to contact families discreetly, verify relationships, ensure they had the right people. And they needed to excavate the final cache, the triangle symbol on Blackwell's map. First, though, they needed one more ally. That evening, Vera visited with dinner as usual. Amos and Martha were waiting. They decided together that Vera needed to know. She deserved to know about her grandmother's items, and her connections in the community would be invaluable in reaching families. When they told her, Vera's reaction was everything Amos had feared and hoped for. Shock first, her hand going to her throat, then anger at Blackwell at the violation. But quickly that anger transformed into something else. Determination. My grandmother's ring, she said, her voice tight. It's here? You have it. Amos brought out the small box containing Elizabeth Thornton's belongings, the ring, the brooch, the diary. Vera's hands shook as she touched them. She opened the diary, read her grandmother's final entries, and wept. 25 years old, she whispered. She was so young, and she died knowing that ring would stay with her, a connection to her mother and grandmother. And then he took it. I'm sorry, Amos said. I'm so sorry this happened. Vera wiped her eyes, straightened her shoulders. Don't be sorry. You found it. You cared enough to dig, literally. She looked at both of them. What do you need me to do? Over the next days, they became a team. Martha handled research and documentation. Vera reached out to families, making gentle contact, explaining there'd been a discovery at the old church property. Amos continued the physical work, excavating the final cache and preparing the church for the gathering. the last excavation revealed the largest collection yet. Gold coins, diamond jewelry, silver service pieces, the kind of treasures that represented generations of accumulated wealth. Also in the cache was another journal, one Amos hadn't known existed. This journal belonged to Blackwell but covered his final weeks, October 1902. The entries were frantic, desperate. The blackmail letters were tucked between pages, 5 in total, unsigned, written in a crude hand that looked deliberately disguised. "I know what you've buried," the first letter read. "I know where the bodies are, and I know what you took from them. Pay me $1,000 or I go to the sheriff." Each subsequent letter escalated the threats. The final one, dated October 15th, gave Blackwell 3 days to pay. Amos studied the letters under good light, looking for any clue to the author's identity. The paper had a watermark, subtle but visible. It showed a merchant's mark he recognized from his research. The general store that had operated in Redemption Springs from 1880 to 1910. Vera's grandfather had owned that store, but that didn't mean Vera's family was involved. Lots of people bought paper from the general store. It was the only one in town. Still, it was a connection worth exploring. Martha dug into Vera's family history, while Vera herself focused on contacting descendants. What they found was interesting, but not conclusive. Vera's grandfather, James McCready, had been a prominent citizen, store owner, town council member, pillar of the community. He'd also, according to old financial records, had significant debts in the early 1900s. Those debts had been mysteriously paid off in 1903, shortly after Blackwell's disappearance. "It doesn't prove anything," Martha said. "But it's suspicious," Amos agreed. But even if James McCready had been the blackmailer, what did it matter now? He was long dead, as was everyone else involved. The only thing that mattered was returning what had been stolen, unless, and this thought troubled Amos, unless the blackmailer had been the murderer. If James McCready had killed Blackwell, that changed things. It meant Vera's family history included not just a store owner, but a murderer. He decided not to mention this possibility to Vera yet. Not until they had more evidence. The preparations continued. They set the gathering for a Saturday afternoon, 2 weeks from the day Martha had first visited the church. 17 families had descendants they could contact. Martha created a detailed presentation explaining the history, showing evidence from journals and documents, laying out the timeline of events. Amos repaired the church as best he could. He fixed the worst of the roof damage, cleared and cleaned the sanctuary, even got some of the pews into usable condition. He wanted the space to feel respectful, dignified. These families were coming to reclaim what had been stolen. The setting mattered. 3 days before the gathering, Amos made a decision about Blackwell's remains. He couldn't leave the preacher in an unmarked grave, murdered and forgotten. Whatever Blackwell's crimes, he deserved at least the dignity of a proper burial. He contacted a local funeral home, explained that he'd found old remains on his property while clearing land. The director was a young man named Pierce, sympathetic and professional. He agreed to handle the remains discreetly, arrange for a simple coffin, and prepare for burial. "Do you know who it was?" Pierce asked. "I have a theory," Amos said. But nothing certain. The funeral home removed the remains respectfully. Amos had photographed everything first. The location, the position of the body, the ring, in case authorities ever needed to investigate. But for now, he just wanted to give the dead man peace. He ordered a headstone. Simple granite, nothing fancy. The inscription read, "Josiah Blackwell, 1851-1902. May he find the peace he sought." Martha questioned this. "Are you sure? After what he did?" "He was a thief and a coward," Amos said. "But he was also a human being who tried to make amends. Even if he failed, he tried. That counts for something." The night before the gathering, Amos couldn't sleep. He sat in the church, surrounded by labeled boxes containing jewelry and personal effects, and thought about all the people whose lives had intersected in this place. The families who'd buried their loved ones with care and devotion. Blackwell, who'd stolen from them out of desperation. The blackmailer who'd pushed Blackwell to his death. And now Amos, trying to untangle a century of wrong. He thought about his own family, about Margaret, who would have approved of what he was doing, about Sarah, who would have been proud, and about Thomas, his grandson, whom he hadn't spoken to in 6 years. On impulse, Amos pulled out his phone. It was late, but not too late. He dialed the number he'd memorized but never called. Thomas answered on the 3rd ring, his voice wary. "Hello?" "Thomas, it's your grandfather." Amos. Silence. "Then Grandpa? I didn't expect to hear from you." "I know. I'm sorry. I've been a poor excuse for a grandfather. I let grief turn me into a ghost. It's okay. It's not okay," Amos said firmly. "You lost your mother. You needed family. And I disappeared into my own pain. That was wrong. I was wrong." More silence. Then Thomas's voice, thick with emotion. "I tried to reach out at first, but you never—" "I know. I'm sorry, son. I truly am." Amos took a breath. "I saw a news story online last week about a man who'd bought an old church and was returning stolen property to families. It was from 2 towns over. Made me think that maybe it's not too late to do something right. To be someone worth knowing. You were always worth knowing," Thomas said quietly. "I missed you, Grandpa." Tears ran down Amos's face. "I missed you too. And if you're willing, I'd like to try again. Be in your life. Meet your wife. I heard you got married 3 years ago. And we have a daughter, Emma. She's 3, a great-granddaughter." Amos had a great-granddaughter he'd never met. "I'd like to meet her," he said. "If that's all right." "She should know her great-grandfather," Thomas said. "Mom would have wanted that." They talked for an hour. Thomas explained how he'd moved away because his father couldn't bear to stay in a place that reminded him of Sarah, how they'd tried to maintain contact with Amos but eventually stopped because it seemed to cause him pain, how Thomas had always hoped that someday his grandfather would come back to them. "I'm coming back," Amos promised. "Not just in words. I'm here. I want to be part of your life, of Emma's life." "Then come visit," Thomas said. "Please, soon." "I will. I have something I need to do first. Tomorrow, actually. But after that, I'll come." After they hung up, Amos sat in the quiet church and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Real solid hope that maybe he could still build something good out of the ruins of his life. The morning of the gathering dawned clear and cool. Amos rang the church bell at 9 in the morning, the first time it had rung in 40 years. The sound carried across the valley, clear and strong, calling people to witness truth being told. By noon, people began arriving. Descendants of the 23 families, some elderly, some middle-aged, a few younger people who'd come out of curiosity or family obligation. They filled the church, 60 people in the pews, more standing in the back. Amos stood at the pulpit, Martha and Vera flanking him. His hands shook, but his voice held steady. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "What I'm about to tell you is difficult. It's about theft, betrayal, and secrets that have been buried for more than a century. But it's also about truth, restitution, and the possibility that even the oldest wrongs can be made right." He told them everything. How he'd bought the church on a whim. How his mule had refused to enter the cemetery, sensing something wrong. How he'd uncovered the hidden caches, found the journals, discovered Blackwell's crimes. He showed them the evidence, the journals, the maps, the confession letter. People gasped, murmured, some wept. But they listened. "Reverend Josiah Blackwell stole from 23 families," Amos continued. "He took items that were meant to accompany your ancestors into death. Wedding rings, family heirlooms, treasures that represented love and memory. He hid them in false graves in his own cemetery, and he took that secret with him when he died." He paused. "Let that sink in. But today we return what was stolen. Today we give back what should never have been taken. And we honor the memory of those who were violated by this crime." Martha stepped forward with the first box. "When I call your name, please come forward." One by one, families approached. Vera was first, receiving her grandmother's ring and brooch with tears streaming down her face. Sheriff Burke came next, accepting his great-aunt's cameo with quiet dignity. Others followed. Each returned a small ceremony, a healing of old wounds. The elderly woman who received her great-grandfather's pocket watch held it to her chest and sobbed. The man who got his grandmother's locket opened it, saw the photograph inside, and had to sit down. A young couple accepted a set of silver candlesticks that had belonged to her great-great-grandmother. Pieces they'd only seen in family stories. Each return was personal, emotional, sacred. Some items remained unclaimed. Families with no traceable descendants or connections too distant to verify. Amos promised to hold those in trust, to keep searching for rightful owners. When the last item had been returned, Amos spoke again. "There's one more thing. We found Reverend Blackwell's remains. He didn't run away as everyone thought. Someone killed him, buried him without ceremony or marker in his own cemetery. We believe he was murdered by the person who was blackmailing him, but we have no proof. What we do know is that he was a flawed, broken man who committed terrible crimes, but also tried in the end to make amends. He failed, but the attempt mattered. He explained about the reburial, the simple marker. Tomorrow at 2 o'clock we'll hold a service. Just a brief ceremony acknowledging that even criminals deserve the dignity of a proper burial. Anyone who wishes to attend is welcome." After the formal gathering ended, people stayed. They talked, shared stories about their ancestors, examined the evidence Amos had laid out. Many thanked him personally, shook his hand. Some embraced him. Sheriff Burke pulled him aside. "This was a good thing you did. A hard thing, but good. If you ever need anything, thank you," Amos said. "That means more than you know." As the sun set and the last families departed, Amos stood in the empty church with Martha and Vera. They'd done it. They'd returned what was stolen, given families closure, honored the dead. "You look exhausted," Vera said, studying Amos's face in the fading light. "But also different. Lighter somehow." Amos smiled. "Maybe I am. Carried that weight for weeks. Now it's shared, distributed among the people it belonged to all along." Martha began packing up the documentation. "There's still the question of what happens to the church. Legally, you might not own it. The property was purchased with stolen funds." "I know," Amos said. "Been thinking about that. Maybe the church should belong to the community. A memorial, a reminder. Something good growing from something bad. That's a beautiful thought," Vera said. "We could form a trust, maintain it as a historical site. The cemetery, too. Keep the stories alive so they're not forgotten again." They talked through logistics as darkness fell, making plans for the future. But underneath the practical discussion, Amos felt something shifting in himself. For the first time in 8 years, he wasn't just existing. He was building something, contributing, mattering. The next afternoon, a small group gathered for Blackwell's burial. Maybe 20 people. Some from families he'd stolen from, some just townspeople curious about the story. The coffin was simple pine. The grave dug in a corner of the cemetery that had been cleared and prepared. Amos had asked Martha if she knew any preachers who might conduct a service. She'd found a retired minister from the next town over, a kind man in his 70s who agreed to say a few words. "We gather to lay to rest Josiah Blackwell," the minister began. "A man who sinned greatly and suffered for it. We don't excuse his crimes. We don't forget the harm he caused. But we acknowledge his humanity and trust that mercy exists even for the most broken among us." It was brief, respectful, honest. When they lowered the coffin, Amos found himself silently thanking the man who'd inadvertently brought purpose back to his life. Without Blackwell's crimes and their discovery, Amos would still be drifting, empty, waiting to die. Instead, he had work to do, connections to rebuild, a future that extended beyond his own loneliness. After the service, as people filtered away, Sheriff Burke approached Amos. "Got a minute?" They walked to the edge of the cemetery, where Maisie grazed contentedly. The mule had finally made peace with the ground, Amos noticed. Whatever wrongness she'd sensed had been resolved. "I did some checking," Burke said, "about the blackmail angle. Thought you'd want to know what I found." Amos waited. Reverend Samuel Crenshaw, the man who took over after Blackwell disappeared, he left town suddenly in 1904, 2 years after Blackwell died. Church records show he'd been searching for something, asking questions about the previous reverend's belongings and records. Then one day he just left. No notice, no explanation. You think he killed Blackwell? Can't prove it. Too many years gone by, no real evidence. But the pattern fits. Samuel's father sold Blackwell the land. Pembley would have known about potential irregularities. Samuel had money problems at his previous post. Shows up here right after Blackwell disappears. Spends 2 years searching for something. Doesn't find it, leaves. He was looking for the treasure, Amos said. Probably. Killed Blackwell thinking he could find it himself, but the map was too well hidden. Burke paused. There's something else. I talked to some old-timers. One remembered his grandfather saying that in 1904, James McCready, Vera's grandfather, had a huge fight with Reverend Crenshaw. Public argument in the street. Shortly after Crenshaw left town, the pieces clicked together. McCready discovered Crenshaw had killed Blackwell. That's my guess. Maybe he'd suspected Blackwell's crimes, maybe even written those blackmail letters himself. But murder? That crossed a line. So he confronted Crenshaw, ran him out of town. Can't prove any of it, but it makes sense. Amos thought about Vera, about her grandfather being tangled up in this mess. Should he tell her? Would it matter after all these years? Leave it alone, Burke advised, reading his expression. Everyone involved is long dead. The truth would only hurt Vera, and for what? To satisfy historical curiosity? Some secrets are better left buried. Maybe Burke was right. The important thing, returning stolen items to families, had been accomplished. The rest was just details, shadows of old sins committed by people who'd already faced whatever judgment waited beyond life. That evening, Thomas called. I saw an article online about the church ceremony. That was you, wasn't it? The man who returned all those stolen items. It was, Amos admitted. Grandpa, that's incredible. I'm so proud of you. Those words, I'm proud of you, hit Amos harder than he expected. When was the last time anyone had been proud of him? When had he done anything worth being proud of? I'd like to come visit, Thomas said. This weekend, if that works. Bring Emma and Katie, my wife. Emma's been asking about her great-grandfather. I showed her pictures of Mom, told her stories. She wants to meet you. Amos's throat tightened. I'd like that very much. We'll drive up Saturday morning. Maybe you could show us the church. Tell us the whole story? I will. I'll tell you everything. After they hung up, Amos sat on the church steps watching the stars emerge. Maisie wandered over, nuzzled his shoulder with her soft nose. He scratched behind her ears. We did good, old girl, he murmured. Found something worth finding. Maybe found ourselves too, the mule snorted, which Amos chose to interpret as agreement. Inside the church, his bedroll waited. But for the first time, the space didn't feel like a refuge from life. It felt like a home, the beginning of something new. He thought about Margaret, about how she'd always believed people could change, could grow, could become better versions of themselves. She'd believed it about him, even when he didn't believe it himself. And Sarah, bright, fierce Sarah, who'd never let him wallow in self-pity when she was alive. She'd want him to keep going, keep building, keep connecting with Thomas and Emma. Maybe the dead didn't need treasures in their graves. Maybe what they needed was for the living to remember them, honor them by living well. Amos pulled out his father's pocket watch, held it in the starlight. Still frozen at 3:47, still broken. But that was all right. Some things didn't need to be fixed. Some things were perfect in their brokenness, testaments to time past and lessons learned. Tomorrow, he'd start working on the trust for the church property, get the legal framework in place to transfer ownership to the community, make sure the cemetery was maintained, the stories preserved, the history remembered, and this weekend he'd meet his great-granddaughter. Start building the relationship he should have built years ago with Thomas. Start being the grandfather, the man he'd always meant to be. The night air was cold but clean. Amos breathed deeply, feeling truly alive for the first time in years. He'd come to this church looking for a place to die quietly. Instead, he'd found a reason to live. The days leading up to Thomas's visit passed in a blur of activity. Amos cleaned the church more thoroughly than before, organized his sparse belongings, even bought fresh groceries from Vera's store. He wanted everything to be right, to show Thomas that he wasn't the broken man he'd been for the past 8 years. Vera helped him prepare, bringing flowers for the church and offering to make lunch for everyone. "You're nervous," she observed with a smile. Terrified, Amos admitted. I haven't seen him in 6 years. And I've never met Emma or Katie. What if they see me and realize I'm not worth knowing? Then they'd be blind, Vera said firmly. You just gave 23 families closure they never expected. You honored the dead and healed the living. If that doesn't make you worth knowing, I don't know what does. Martha stopped by Friday evening with a gift, a photo album she'd put together using copies of the historical documents, photographs of the church and cemetery, and newspaper clippings about the gathering. For Thomas, she said, so he can see what his grandfather accomplished. Amos turned the pages slowly, seeing his work through someone else's eyes. It did look impressive, not because of him, but because of what it represented. Second chances, redemption, the possibility that even old wrongs could be made right. Saturday morning arrived too quickly. Amos was up before dawn, checking and rechecking everything. He'd repaired the front steps, cleared a path through the cemetery to the interesting headstones, even gotten Maisie groomed, though the mule had opinions about that. At 10 o'clock, a silver sedan pulled up the rutted drive. Amos's heart hammered as 3 people got out. Thomas looked like Sarah, same sharp features, same direct gaze. But he was a man now, nearly 40, with his own family. His wife Katie was petite with warm eyes and a kind smile. And Emma was a small whirlwind of energy with dark curls and Sarah's eyes. She bounced out of the car and immediately ran to Maisie.
Is that a donkey?
Mule, Amos called, his voice rough. Her name's Maisie. Thomas walked toward him slowly, and for a moment they just looked at each other. Then Thomas smiled, Sarah's smile, and held out his hand. Amos took it, then pulled his grandson into a fierce embrace. I'm sorry, Amos whispered. I'm so sorry for all the lost years. We're here now, Thomas said. That's what matters. Katie hugged Amos next, and then Emma was tugging on his sleeve. Are you really my great-grandpa? Daddy says you're a hero. Amos knelt down, looked into those young eyes. I'm your great-grandpa. I don't know about hero, but I'm very glad to meet you. Can I pet the mule? She'd like that. But ask her permission first. Mules are particular about manners. He watched Emma approach Maisie carefully, talking to the animal in a soft voice. Maisie, who was usually standoffish with strangers, lowered her head and let the child pat her nose. She likes you, Amos said. That's high praise from Maisie. They spent the morning touring the church and cemetery. Amos told them everything, how he'd bought the property on a whim, how Maisie had refused to enter the cemetery, how one discovery had led to another. Thomas asked good questions, really listening. Katie took pictures. Emma collected pretty rocks and chased butterflies between headstones. Over lunch, Vera's contribution, a spread of sandwiches and salad. Thomas asked about the future. What will you do now? Stay here. For a while, Amos said. There's work to be done, setting up the trust, maintaining the cemetery, and I've grown fond of this place. It gave me back something I thought I'd lost. What's that? Purpose. A reason to wake up in the morning. He paused. But I'd like to visit you too, if that's all right. Get to know this little one properly. He nodded to Emma, who was feeding crackers to Maisie. We'd love that, Katie said. Anytime. Your family. The words settled into Amos's chest like a warm stone. That afternoon, Martha and Vera joined them. They sat on the church steps together, 3 generations plus adopted family, and talked about everything and nothing. Emma fell asleep in Amos's lap, trusting and content. He held her carefully, marveling at how light she was, how precious. She looks like Sarah did at that age, Thomas said softly. Mom would have loved her. She would have, Amos agreed. And she'd be proud of you, the man you've become, the family you've built. I learned from the best. Even when you weren't there, Mum's lessons stuck. Thomas met his eyes. And now you're here. That's what counts. As evening approached and Thomas's family prepared to leave, Emma hugged Amos tight around the neck. Will you come visit us soon? You can meet my friends and see my room. I will, Amos promised. Very soon. They drove away with promises to return, plans already forming for holidays and birthdays. Amos stood watching until the car disappeared, then turned to find Vera and Martha smiling at him. Good day, Martha asked. Best day in 8 years, Amos said truthfully. That evening, the three of them sat in the church as twilight gathered. They'd become a team, then friends, now something like family themselves. Martha with her sharp mind and generous spirit. Vera with her warmth and practical wisdom. Both had helped him carry burdens that would have crushed him alone. "The church council met yesterday," Vera said, "about your proposal for a community trust. They approved it unanimously. The property will transfer to the trust by month's end. You won't own it anymore," Martha added. "But you'll be welcome to stay here as long as you want. Caretaker position, salary included." Amos hadn't expected that. "You don't need to—" "We do," Vera interrupted. "This place needs someone who cares about it. Someone who understands its history and what it represents. That's you." He felt tears prick his eyes. "Thank you, both of you, for everything." "Thank yourself," Martha said. "You did the work. We just helped." As stars emerged overhead, Amos walked through the cemetery one last time that day. He knew these graves now, not just names and dates, but stories. People who'd lived and loved and died, who'd been forgotten until one stubborn old cowboy and his mule had dug up the truth. At Blackwell's new grave, he paused. The headstone stood clean and simple in the moonlight. Someone, probably Vera, had left flowers. "Hope you found your peace," Amos said quietly. "Thanks for leaving the map. Thanks for trying, even though you failed. Sometimes trying is enough." Maisie appeared beside him, pressing her warm bulk against his leg. They stood together in the quiet man and mule, both having found what they'd been looking for. Not treasure. Not salvation. Just purpose, connection, and the chance to make something right in a world that often felt overwhelmingly wrong. 6 months later, the church looked different. Not completely restored. That would take years and more money than the small community trust could provide, but cared for. The roof no longer leaked. The windows had been repaired. The cemetery was maintained, paths cleared, headstones straightened where possible. Fresh flowers appeared regularly on many graves, left by descendants who'd learned their family stories and wanted to honor those who'd come before. Amos had settled into his role as caretaker with unexpected contentment. His days followed a gentle rhythm, maintaining the grounds in the morning, giving occasional tours to visitors curious about the church's history, spending evenings reading or talking with Vera and Martha. Once a month, Thomas brought Emma for a weekend visit. Twice, Amos had driven to their home, staying in their guest room and playing grandfather with enthusiasm he'd thought long dead in him. The story had spread beyond Redemption Springs. A regional newspaper had picked it up, then a national wire service. Amos had given exactly one interview before refusing all others. He wasn't interested in attention or acclaim. The work itself had been the reward, but the publicity had brought unexpected benefits. 3 more families had come forward, distant descendants of people buried in the cemetery, tracking down their roots after seeing the news. 2 had claimed items from the unclaimed pile. The 3rd simply wanted to visit their ancestor's grave and hear the story. On a warm afternoon in late spring, Sheriff Burke stopped by with coffee and news. Samuel Crenshaw died in 1927, Burke said. Found the death certificate. He was living in Nevada under an assumed name, working as a clerk. No family, no money, buried in a pauper's grave. Rough ending, Amos observed. Fitting one, maybe. Killed a man, stole a church, found nothing, died alone. Burke paused. There's more. I did some digging into the blackmail letters, cross-referenced handwriting samples from old town records. Best match, James McCready, Vera's grandfather. Amos had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed still stung. You going to tell her? What would be the point? Her grandfather's been dead 60 years. The blackmail, wrong as it was, might have been his way of trying to force Blackwell to confess, to make things right. He didn't know Crenshaw would kill the man. Burke shrugged. Like I said before, some secrets are better left buried, Amos agreed. The important truths had been told. The rest was just historical footnote. That evening, Vera brought dinner as she often did. They'd fallen into a comfortable routine of sharing meals several times a week. She set out the food, while Amos cleared space at the small table he'd set up in what used to be the preacher's quarters. Martha's organizing a dedication ceremony, Vera said. For the historical marker. The county approved it, official recognition of the site's importance. She wants to hold it next month. She's been working on that for weeks, Amos said, determined to make sure the story's remembered properly. That's Martha. Once she gets hold of a project, Vera smiled. You three make a good team. We do, Amos agreed. He'd been thinking about that lately, about how three lonely people had found each other through tragedy and turned it into something good. Martha with her sharp mind and love of truth. Vera with her generous heart and community connections. Amos with his stubborn refusal to take the easy path. I've been thinking, Vera said carefully, about what comes next. For you, I mean, Amos looked up, curious. I'm happy here. This is good work. It is. But you're 68, Amos. This physical labor, maintaining the grounds, all that digging and hauling, it's wearing on you. I can see it. She wasn't wrong. His back hurt more days than not now. The arthritis in his hands had worsened. He was slower than he'd been 6 months ago. I've got a few good years left, he said. I hope you've got many good years left, Vera corrected. But maybe they could be spent differently. The trust can hire younger people for the heavy work. You could focus on what you're actually good at, talking to visitors, preserving the history, being the heart of this place. The heart, Amos repeated, liking the sound of it. That's what you are. The reason this place matters isn't the building or the cemetery. It's the story of what you did here, how you chose to do right when you could have chosen easy. She reached across the table, took his hand. Don't wear yourself out with physical labor when your real contribution is so much bigger. He squeezed her hand, grateful for her wisdom and her care. When had he started to care so much about Vera's opinion? When had her presence become essential to his daily happiness? I'll think about it, he promised. Later that night, after Vera had gone, Amos sat outside with Maisie and watched the stars. The mule grazed nearby, content in the darkness. She'd grown fat on good grass and regular oats, was healthier now than when they'd arrived. Both of them were. He thought about Margaret, about how she'd always pushed him to be better, to do more, to live fully. She would have liked Vera, he realized, would have appreciated her directness and warmth, would have been pleased that Amos had found companionship again, and Sarah, fiery, passionate Sarah, who'd never accepted half measures or easy answers. She would have been proud of what he'd done here. Proud that he'd chosen the hard right thing over the easy wrong thing. From his pocket, Amos pulled out his father's watch. Still broken, still frozen at 3:47. But looking at it now, he didn't feel the weight of broken promises and lost time. He felt instead a connection to the past, to the people who'd shaped him, to the long line of Reddingtons who'd tried their best and sometimes succeeded. He had something new to add to that legacy now. Not just mistakes and regrets, but redemption. Not just loss, but recovery. The next morning, Amos drove into town to the stone carver's shop. The proprietor recognized him immediately. Mr. Reddington, what can I do for you? I'd like to order a headstone, Amos said. For myself. To be placed in the church cemetery when the time comes. The stone carver nodded, unsurprised. Many people pre-ordered their markers. What inscription would you like? Amos had thought about this for weeks. Amos Reddington, 1957 to... He left the end date blank, and below that just 3 words. He tried right. Not, he did right? The stone carver asked. No, Amos said firmly. I didn't always do right. Made plenty of mistakes, hurt people I loved, wasted years I can't get back. But in the end I tried. And sometimes trying is all we can do. The stone carver wrote it down, smiling. That's honest. I like it. One more thing, Amos added. I'd like it placed near Reverend Blackwell's grave. Close enough that someone looking at both would understand they're connected. The preacher who stole from the cemetery. The man who sinned greatly and tried to repent, Amos corrected. We're all just people, doing the best we can with what we've been given. Some of us stumble worse than others. Some of us find our way back. Blackwell and I, we both tried to make things right in the end. That connects us more than any crime or any virtue. Back at the church, Amos found Martha organizing files and Vera arranging flowers on several graves. They worked together companionably, 3 people who'd found unexpected family in each other. That evening, Thomas called with news. Katie was pregnant. Emma would be a big sister come fall. That's wonderful, Amos said, his voice thick with emotion. Just wonderful. We want you there, Thomas said. When the baby comes, and for holidays, and birthdays, and just all of it, Grandpa. We want you to be part of it all. I will be, Amos promised. I'm not going anywhere. After he hung up, Amos walked through the cemetery one final time that day. The sun was setting, painting the headstones in shades of gold and amber. He knew every name now, every story. These weren't just dead strangers anymore. They were people, real people who'd lived and loved and lost, who'd been remembered and forgotten and remembered again. He stopped at Blackwell's grave, where someone had left fresh wildflowers. We're both getting second chances, Amos said to the stone. You through my work here, me through the grace of good people willing to forgive. Neither of us deserves it, probably. But here we are. Maisie appeared at his side, as she always did. He scratched behind her ears, grateful for her steady presence. You knew, he told the mule. From the very first day, you knew something was wrong with this ground. Smart girl. You led me to exactly what I needed to find, the mule snorted, which Amos took as acknowledgement. Together they walked back to the church as the last light faded. Amos Reddington was 68 years old. He had arthritis, a bad back, a broken pocket watch, and not much money. But he had purpose. He had family, both blood and chosen. He had work that mattered. He had tried right, and in the trying had found something he'd thought lost forever. He had found home.